This is another issue spot of a past bar hypothetical. This one's a California bar hypothetical in community property. But before I start the hypothetical, please give me some feedback in the comments below about what else would help you toward your bar review or your law school exam review. What besides these kinds of issue spotting exercises? Should I start a Patreon channel and put PDFs of the hypotheticals in there? Do you want live chats? What would help you the most? Okay, now take a look at this hypothetical. The first thing you see at the bottom of the page, if you're on the bar, is an instruction to answer according to California law. That really narrows the subjects down for you. And when you look above at the call, it says, what are Harry's and Wanda's rights and liabilities, if any, regarding? The H and W names basically tell you it's community property, husband and wife. So we have 4 calls. 1 is a condominium, 2 is a joint savings account, 3 is rental property, and 4 is a hospital bill. Okay, this is standard format for community property essays. That's a very standard call. They generally list 3 or 4, occasionally 5 things that you need to analyze and characterize at dissolution. Here we've got 4. So we go to the facts and we see that in 2003, while planning their wedding, Harry and Wanda, a California couple, spent weeks discussing how they could each own and control their respective salaries. Sometime before their wedding, they prepared a document in which they stated, after we marry, Wanda's salary is her property and Harry's salary is his property. At the same time, they prepared a separate document in which they stated, we agree we do not need legal advice. They signed and dated each document, and then they subsequently married. So what's going on in this paragraph is they're setting up an attempt to create an enforceable prenuptial agreement. And a prenup is really a transmutation that happens before the marriage. So let's stop and take a look at the law in California about prenups. What's required and when will they be enforceable? So they're trying to change the nature of their earnings during marriage and make them separate property instead of community. So go over here to California community property and look at conduct by the parties that changes the character of property, which is what a prenup is. It's a transmutation. Ordinarily, earnings are community property. They are from the skill and effort of a spouse during the marital community, so they belong to the community. But a premarital agreement, a prenup, can change the nature of that property. California is fairly straightforward about what's required. They're pretty simple elements. It has to be signed, it has to be written, no consideration is needed. But the key is to be enforceable against one of the spouses. That thing cannot have been executed in a way that was not voluntary. And so what you need to look at is what voluntary requires, represented by independent legal counsel at signing or advisedly and expressly waived in writing. You need a 7-day waiting period before signing. You need, if unrepresented, you need to be fully informed of the terms and acknowledge them in a separate writing. And then the second defense is that you can argue that it was unconscionable when executed. In other words, the party against whom this is being enforced wasn't given full, fair, reasonable financial disclosure and didn't voluntarily and expressly waive the right to that disclosure. Now, there are also things that are against public policy. They may come up here, but I don't see them so far. Notice the way we've framed this in power law is that there are basic elements needed to form a prenup, but then there are defenses that go to whether that written agreement they formed is enforceable or not. That's the way we choose to look at this. Your bar review materials may present voluntariness as an element. It may present not unconscionable as an element. It really doesn't matter when you answer this, as long as you know these technical requirements. When can you say something was not voluntarily executed? When can you say it was unconscionable when it was executed? That's what they want you to be able to analyze. So now that we've looked at these technical requirements, let's go back and look at what they gave us in the hypothetical and whether they were met or not. It says that they prepared the document. At the same time, they prepared a separate document in which they said, we agree we do not need legal advice. They signed and dated each document. That does not match what is needed to be voluntary. If you're not represented by independent legal counsel, you have to have a 7-day waiting period before signing. It's unclear whether they did that. If you're unrepresented, you have to be fully informed of the terms, and you have to acknowledge that in a separate writing. There is no separate writing here. So I would say that this was not voluntarily executed. What about unconscionable? Was each given full, fair, reasonable financial disclosure? In other words, adequate knowledge of the other's finances? Or voluntarily and expressly waived that right? I don't see that in the facts either. So when it comes time to analyze this prenup in my answer, I'm going to argue that it's not going to be enforceable, that it will not successfully transmute their earnings from community property to separate property of each spouse. Now, where am I going to put that analysis? Well, it doesn't matter. I could put it here up front when I talk about all the basic definitions. I could follow that by a section on prenups and what it takes and whether they're enforceable or not, and analyze it right there up front, and then move into more of the calls. Or I could analyze this within the call in which it's first relevant, and it doesn't matter. So let's move on. In 2004, Harry used his salary to buy a condominium and took title in his name alone. His salary, wait a minute, they're already married. I think that prenup is unenforceable, and so his salary belongs to the community. It's skill and effort of a spouse during the existence of the community. And so the form of title is not dispositive. That's an issue I'm going to want to talk about. I'm going to say that the prenup is unenforceable. Form of title is not dispositive. That's community property. That's call 1. What about the next paragraph? In 2005, Harry and Wanda opened a joint savings account at their local bank. So we have jointly titled property here. Each year thereafter, they each deposited $5,000 from their salaries into the account. Well, again, because the prenup is unenforceable, that would be community property anyway. But even if you thought the prenup was enforceable, the presumption is that when you take title in joint form, that's community property. And I see nothing here that would overcome that presumption. So this is going to be a community property asset, and that's call 2. This is common for California bar hypotheticals. Each paragraph goes to a different call. They're not always that way, but often. Next paragraph. In 2015, Harry discovered that Wanda used money from their joint account to buy rental property and take title in her name alone. Well, I've already established for the greater that form of title is not dispositive. Interest is the key. Here, money from their joint account is going to be community property. That rental property is going to be a community property asset. But the other subject I want to discuss right here is that spouses are fiduciaries to each other. And Wanda has just violated her fiduciary duties in taking title in her name alone and essentially hiding this from Harry. That's call 3. The next paragraph says, in 2016, Harry and Wanda permanently separated. That gives me an issue of legal permanent separation. I'm going to tell the bar grader what the elements are. It has to be an intent to separate. There has to be a physical separation. That intent has to be communicated to the other spouse. The next part says, and Wanda moved out of the condominium. There's your physical separation. That's required. They cannot stay living in the same house and perfect a permanent separation. Wanda thereafter required emergency surgery for a medical condition resulting in a hospital bill of $50,000. Then later, Harry files a petition for dissolution of marriage. Okay, this one is a bit more complicated to analyze in that you have to establish what a legal permanent separation is, that they have accomplished a legal permanent separation, and that the consequence of that is that after permanent separation, each spouse's income now is separate property, and debts they take on are separate property debts. But there are exceptions to that, and one is necessities of life. You can't starve your soon-to-be ex-spouse out. If it's a necessary, then you have to contribute toward that. And that's what call 4 is about. So even though they're legally permanently separated, the community is going to have to participate in paying this hospital bill. That's the 4 calls. I think setting up the prenuptial agreement and whether it's enforceable or not is going to take a chunk of my time. After I've established that, then the 4 calls aren't so difficult. The first one is particularly simple, given our conclusion about the prenup anyway. The second one is the same. It's fairly straightforward. You give that joint title presumption and analyze it. The third one perhaps takes a bit more time. The fourth one, more time yet, because you have to establish what a legal permanent separation is, what that ordinarily means, and what the exception is. Things like hospital bills, food, shelter. Fairly straightforward community property essay, except that you had to know all that detail about prenups in order to not go astray on this one. California Bar has tested prenuptial agreements several times, so they do expect everyone to know that law in some detail. Again, if this has been helpful to you, please subscribe and please like the video and help me spread the word. And if you've made it this far in this video, then yeah, please do comment and tell me what else would be helpful besides simply issue spotting more essays. Tomorrow or the next day, I'll issue spot another community property essay. And I think the next one will be a little more complex than this one as far as the analysis of the issues goes.